especially I want to thank the Historical Society for sponsoring this. And I have more people to thank after this. First slide. Homeland is kind of contested concept. What is homeland? People think of Palestinian homeland, right? But is Hong Kong a homeland? For many of us, especially those who went through this half decade of protests recently, Hong Kong has become a homeland. And I'll talk about my own reflection on what Hong Kong means to me. Next. I'll cover in my talk these five themes. Five themes, yeah. And I'll start off with having a Hong Kong identity. Next. Hong Kong identity. And that's maybe a new concept, but since I was born in Hong Kong, I acquired it being born there. And next slide. I was born to a Chinese Hakka father and a Qiuzhou mother, who actually was born in the US. And so my primary languages when I was growing up was English, actually, and Qiuzhou. I learned Cantonese maybe on the streets and in the playgrounds at school. Next. So I still have that dimple. And next. And I went to this school, Diocesan Boys School, which is quite well known in Hong Kong, partly because the founder of the Chinese Republic went there. Sun Yat-sen also attended that school, but not at the same time. Next. Hong Kong has now reached the dictionaries. It's defined as in the Oxford English Dictionary. Next. And Hong Kongers love Hong Kong. This is a t-shirt put out by an activist group that is now dissolved, Hong Kong Indigenous, with different aspects of identity on the t-shirt. And this one is the bag they came out with that says we need to actually not just accept Hong Kong identity as it is, but we need to do something about it. And so it encourages people. Can you go back to that slide? Encourage people. Thank you. Encourage people to learn about the history of Hong Kong, to build an identity, and also to reclaim our homeland. Next. So China is not the homeland for many of these people that identify as Hong Kongers. When you talk about homeland, it's because they could have been born in China, but they acquired Hong Kong identity when they moved to Hong Kong. And so anybody can be a Hong Konger, actually, regardless of ethnicity, actually. Next. For instance, in the 2020 census, you could fill in the form and put yourself as a Hong Konger, just as you could put yourself in as a Taiwanese. And that the results for the Hong Konger option have not been released yet. Next. The public opinion polls in Hong Kong have consistently shown that overwhelming majority of people identify as Hong Konger rather than Chinese. This is from PORI, a group that I'm associated with as honorary data archivist. The results are similar to what is in Taiwan, where more people, overwhelming majority, identify as Taiwanese rather than Chinese. And as you can see, the green line is the people from 18 to 29 here for Hong Kong, and that's the younger people. It's actually went up and it's maybe dropped a bit because some people have left Hong Kong now. Next. the US actually recognizes Hong Kong as a category for deferred what do you call it, expatriation. You can actually, Hong Kong is now, the president has signed a safe harbor policy, so that if you're in Hong Kong right now, in US right now, sorry, you can stay for 18 months from the date of this declaration a few months ago. And the definitions for what is a Hong Konger is pretty broad. Next. This says that it's basically identity papers. If you have a passport from Hong Kong or some kind of Hong Kong ID, then you can claim you are Hong Konger, even when you're in the US. So, and you can get a job despite student visa restrictions. Those are waived now, I think, so that you can actually now stay in the US for up to 18 months, and maybe you'll get renewed. There's another bill in Congress to give more details of safe harbor, even more enhanced safe harbor for Hong Kong people coming here. Next. So I'm going to talk about my activism in this field, academic labor. Next. In 1975, there was a first ever in the history of US, a TA strike, teaching assistant strike, for graduate students who are workers at the University of Michigan, where I was a graduate student in Ann Arbor. And it was organized by Graduate Employees Organization. And there's me giving a talk. I was in charge of PR, publicity for the strike. And we went on strike for about a month. And eventually they settled, the university, settled and started negotiating a good contract with us. Next. Among the demands, we were asking for recognition for affirmative action among graduate students. So that was an early thing in 1975. There was already a fight for affirmative action. And I think we succeeded. Next. Another thing was a clause in the contract that was agreed upon right before actually the strike, but they didn't want us to publicize it for some reason, the university. And that was non-discrimination on sexual orientation. So this was in 1975. But eventually the university argued that they had to restrict activities under that clause, what you could do off campus or on campus or in the classroom even. So we thought that was discriminatory and we rejected it because it seemed focused on gay people, queer people at the time, because they assumed that we were going to have sex in the classrooms. Next. But the legacy of that strike actually continues. This was actually in 1999 when the UC system went on strike, and I got a chance to write an op-ed in the LA Times talking about the lessons and the legacy from that time to apply it to UC graduate students who were on strike. Next. Then at the same time, I was very involved in gay liberation movement in the 70s in the US. Next. We were about to celebrate the 200 years of the bicentennial of the US, but activists had come out with this t-shirt that I wore, 200 years of gay oppression, which is what we thought. And why do we think that? Because at the time, homosexuals were banned from coming into the US. It wasn't until maybe a few decades ago that the Supreme Court got rid of that. We were considered people with psychopathic personality. And this was part of a McCarran Act in the 1950s that was also to ban communists. And so at the time, they wanted to ban Communist Party members as well as gay people because they thought the two were the same. Next. I actually drafted the first gay manifesto, with a gay and Asian manifesto back in 75 for a publication called Bridge that came out of from Basement Workshop in Chinatown in New York City. And there I tried to argue for gay awareness because gay Asians were not considered gay. We were active in the civil rights movement. We were active in the anti-war movement, but most people just ignored us. Next. I also organized I gave the first gay liberation politics course at Michigan. My colleague at Michigan, a fellow graduate student who was also very active in GEO, was Gail Rubin, and she had taught classes in women's studies at Michigan. We were both graduate students, but I taught this politics of gay liberation, gay and lesbian liberation course in the 70s. And the dean of the School of Literature, Science, and the Arts considered that my publicity about it, because it was a special course, I did print out my own leaflets. He said the word gay can it be in smaller type, smaller font? I just laughed. He called me up. And then he later became president of Emory University. But in the class, I had a dilemma. Because if they took my class, there were 30 some students or 40 students, it would show up on their transcript, politics of lesbian and gay liberation, maybe. But actually, there were only 18 characters on the computer card. And in those days, you had to fill in a computer card with the name of the class. And I had a choice as a teacher. I could change the name. So I asked the students to agree if that was okay to change the name. So guess what we changed it to? Paul of Lib. Paul of Lib. So it had no gay inference to it. So maybe their parents would be okay with that. Next. So this was that class in an article in the Michigan Daily. Next. Then I also started a magazine in Ann Arbor called Midwest Gay Academic Journal. And then I moved to Temple University in Philadelphia in 78. And there I started a magazine called Gay Insurgent. I resumed the Midwest and changed its name. And so the cover story in the 1980 issue was about the previous few months. We had this conference, the first lesbian and gay march on Washington, which I wanted to document the gay contingent. I and a bunch of other people help organize the gay contingent. And you can see about 8 or 9 people here in the picture. These were the people I knew, that we knew. And we did it by letters or phone calls. I think there was only the emerging of the internet then. There was no World Wide Web then. And so we were able to organize mostly in an analog way, maybe. Next. So in this magazine, I tried to document in my writings what happened. And in this issue of the magazine, we had the speakers. Audre Lorde, the poet, was the keynote speaker at People of Color Third World Conference going on at the same time that weekend. Next. And another was Tana Loy, who was a Chinese American activist who gave the keynote speech at the conference at that event at the Third World Conference. Yeah, next. And then also Michio Cornell, she was the poet, bisexual Asian, Eurasian actually, and she gave a talk at the at the Washington Monument. Next. So the magazine actually got a lot of publicity subsequently. Somebody discovered it, a Korean American film director discovered it at the Museum of Chinese in America and sold his documentary to NBC. So you can look for that online. Unfortunately, he didn't interview me. I was in Hong Kong for Fulbright, and I guess NBC didn't pay for flying to Hong Kong. So there was nothing about who created the magazine. Next. I have documented what happened at the Ann Arbor, at the Washington D.C. march before and after in this article called "Silencing Silence," and there's a picture of me at the beach in Hong Kong during my school days with my schoolmates. So you can find that on that link. Sex laws. The reason I was interested in gay liberation was because my own experience living in colonial Hong Kong, where having say gay sex for men, women were not banned from it. Gross indecency or sodomy were banned, and for sodomy, I think the prison term was life in prison under British colonial era laws. And then when I came to America, like I said, the U.S. actually most U.S. had banned entry of homosexuals, but also many states still made gay sex illegal. So at the time in Washington, we didn't even consider marriage because we thought the priority was to get rid of these repressive laws. Next. And I talked about in this op-ed in the LA Times in 1996, a draconian chemical castration law that California was about to institute, and it came into law on January 1st, I believe, the following year. I got interviewed on CNN about this also, and just this last few weeks, I read that Pakistan is also implementing this kind of law, and so civil liberties groups have risen up against it, because rape and violence against people are not just sexual. It's actually a power thing. So to ban sex under some idea that it's your sex drive that has to be controlled, this is just mythical, my feeling. Next. Then I got involved because as an activist, I was worried about the government spying on me and on other people who were activists. I started a group in Orange County called the Alliance Working for Asian Rights and Empowerment. Next. And this is, I look kind of, what do you call it? Not wild, not wild, but strong maybe in this. So the button was, one of the buttons says end racist mug files. And so we were mostly challenging the practice at the time of taking pictures of Asians and putting them up in police files. They would use Polaroids and detain Asian kids and wait for the police person who had a Polaroid camera. And sometimes they took many pictures, it didn't come out, and they would give them to you, the people that were detained. So we got actually some that were thrown away by the police. Next. So this was a button that we came up with. And next. And the most important thing we put out, I think, were these Know Your Rights card, modeled after the ACLU Know Your Rights card. But this one specifically said, we don't want the police to take your kid's picture. And we get the parents to co-sign on the back so that the kids can have a conversation with the parents about police abuse and discuss that with them. So we passed out maybe thousands of these in high schools in Orange County. Next. So these were some pictures of our demonstrations outside a courthouse in Orange County and also outside the Irvine Police Department. Next. And these three girls were detained and photographed and at the Garden Grove, by the Garden Grove Police Department. And they were part of a class action the ACLU brought. And they got each got a settlement of about 5,000 each. There was Hmong and Vietnamese girls. That's. Then I actually sued the CIA for spying on me. It turns out that under the Freedom of Information Act and Privacy Act, and the Privacy Act, you can actually ask for your files. And for Privacy Act, it's your own files. And it applies to US citizens as well as permanent residents. In the wake of the Vietnam War, where a lot of abuse on campus was exposed by the FBI and CIA, Congress passed a law saying that you can't, this law, Privacy Act, saying that you cannot collect or retain First Amendment related activities, retain material relating to First Amendment activities of US citizens or permanent residents. So I sued under that to get my files. Because when I first wrote away for my files from the CIA, I was working with a magazine that was that I indexed actually, an anti-CIA magazine that I indexed. So I was an indexer, and I thought, well, maybe they'll have something. So it turns out because I'm a Chinese ethnicity, they probably thought I was a spy from China. And so they started tracking my movements throughout Europe. And there are cables sent to CIA headquarters whenever I traveled at the time. So they agreed not to spy on me again, and gave my lawyers $46,000. I couldn't prove damage to myself, so I didn't get any money myself. Next. Documentation and archiving is actually what I do even in the process of activism. Next. So this is more a rhetorical question. Activists, archivists. I think there's more recognition of that, the connection between the two now. But for a long time, archivists were not considered activists. So this is what I've done. I collect materials. I rescue leaflets and posters. And I'm going to give my collection to a research library. Next. Same question in article in Mingbao Daily after a Sunday edition by Lenny Kwok. Next. So I was sent to Hong Kong actually in 2017 to 18 as a Fulbright scholar. And I was tasked with researching protest culture and look at the ways material is archived or not. Next. Because archives can serve as sites of memory and resistance even. So my ideal for Hong Kong now under this repressive era is that archives have to be expatriated from Hong Kong. Collections may have to leave Hong Kong, but eventually repatriated back. And the biggest example of that is the ANC in Africa, African National Congress. Many of the archives were in the rest of Southern Africa. And when they won power, they were able to retrieve those archives. Next. And my writing for OC Weekly, for instance, is a way of documenting. Next. This article I wrote for them, the first article in 1996 that I wrote for them was about Lillian Baker, who had denied that there was actually something called the Japanese internment. She argued that they were having fun in the camps. And the LA Times obituary was praising her. It seemed like a press release from her estate. So I wrote counter to that. Next. I also do a radio show, Subversity, on KUCI, and now it's a podcast. Next. And I've interviewed activists in Hong Kong. He's now in jail. Edward Leung is now in jail for 6 years. He should be out soon for good behavior. He's a philosophy major at the time at Hong Kong U. Next. And his interview has been translated into Cantonese. I interviewed him in English. Next. And his colleague in the same group, Hong Kong Indigenous, who decided they switched places. Ray, Edward would stay in prison, would go to prison, and Ray would escape to Germany. And so I went to Germany to interview him. And that's an article on the right. So that was Ray Wong. He's now living and gotten asylum in Germany. Next. So these are some of the little things I picked up on the way. These are from Pink Dot in Hong Kong during the time of my Fulbright. Next. And these are books about umbrella movement, etc., and the aftermath. Next. So I want to acknowledge the Historical Society of America, especially Shu, Kimberly, and Angelo, for the background work, and NEH and California Humanities for sponsoring this series, and NQAPIA and GAPA for co-sponsoring this, and Amy Sueyoshi, who's going to be next on discussing this segment, and all of you for attending. Thank you. And this is my contact information. Thank you. And then there's another slide, 2 slides. This, actually the Hong Kong on the first one, and the second one, when you flip it, it says add oil, 加油, which now has been banned in Hong Kong. The words 加油. Thank you. Hi, Amy.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank all of you for being here today, and also thank you, Dan, for that very interesting presentation. Such an honor for me to be here and be able to ask you some questions.
It's my honor. It's my honor.
So I know I prepared some questions ahead of time. I also have some questions that just came into my head as you were doing your presentation. So I'm hoping I can ask you some questions that might surprise you at the beginning, and then we'll go into the questions that I told you about
That's
earlier.
Fine.
Okay. So you talked about Hong Konger identity as really solidifying in the midst of the protests. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how your Hong Konger identity, intersects or interacts with your gay identity.
Yeah, I think the reason the earlier days, it was pretty separate, I think. But I did go to a boys' school in Hong Kong, and that was actually quite a good place to meet other gay people. And so I think there's this habit in Hong Kong, as a Hong Konger, you walk around, Ta Bok Tau is putting your arms around each other. It's an Asian thing maybe, but in Hong Kong it's very common when we were growing up. And so you would walk around with your arms around your pals. And so I did that with my boyfriend at the time, and nobody thought anything of it, because that's a common thing to walk around arms over each other. And so, but to me, it was a very gay thing. So there are clues or cues about people, who people could be at the time. And so to me, even though the law was life in prison for sodomy, none of us actually knew about that probably. I mean, I may have read about it later, or maybe after I left Hong Kong. But at the time, we never, you know, even if you ask kids today, do you know what laws there are against statutory rape or something? They would not know. Kids would do what they want, and so nobody would pay attention to a law. And so I'm not even sure. I did some research once about police arrests for gross indecency, etc., in Hong Kong. And I actually wrote a piece and submitted it to an alternative paper in Hong Kong called 70s Biweekly, but they didn't publish it. So that was back in the probably late 70s, I think. Late 60s or 70s, yeah. So I think it was separate. It was definitely separate, the two identities. So it never merged until I went to Michigan, when I was able to come out and help organize this gay march on Washington.
Got it. And then in Michigan, it seems like you were super out, like in 1975, you're organizing at UMichigan, for the TA strike, and you seem to be clearly very out. I just feel like it's in stark contrast to what Helen Zia talks about in Asian American Dreams. She's organizing in Detroit and feels like she can't be out in terms of the Asian American movement. So can you talk a little bit about what it meant for you to be out and just in contrast to sort of other things we hear from other activists during the 70s who say it was very difficult to be out?
To me, it wasn't difficult because I was already, I think it was because of my Hong Kong identity. My mother took me to the American Library. USIS had a library in Hong Kong at the time, United States Information Service, the propaganda agency of the State Department. But they actually operated public libraries in Hong Kong and other places. And I would check out gay books from USIS library. My mother never, she was a librarian actually at my, the co-ed school, the girls' school that was affiliated with the Anglican Church. I went to the boys' side of it, and they were in separate parts of Hong Kong. But my mother was a librarian there, and she'd never looked at what I checked out. So I was able to read, and also I would go to movies with my boyfriend and take in a lot of even gay movies, I think, that were at the time coming out, being released. Yeah.
And you never worried about being outed or things like that?
I outed myself. I think what happened was I lived, ever since I came to America to live, I have lived apart from my family. I think that helps, because my parents were very conservative, and when I came out to them in an aerogram, I actually came out in an aerogram. You know what that is?
Yes.
Aerogram letters. For the audience, maybe they don't know.
Yeah.
Or they
Please tell us, Dan.
It's a letter. It's a piece of paper that the post office would print out, and you could seal it actually, and mail it abroad. And so I mailed a letter to my parents saying I was gay, and they cried for 3 days and nights. And so it was not a nice thing. But I don't think my father ever accepted. My mother actually did come and live with me in Costa Mesa for a while. And at that time I was in Costa Mesa. So she, I think she just basically avoided the question, but I think I had gay magazines all over the place in my apartment at the time. I still have, but but she didn't say anything. Yeah.
And you had no concerns about being alienated from the left or the Asian American movement during the 70s, being out?
No, I think there were leftists who were gay Asians also, and I write about it in the article "Silencing Silence" about one of them, Steve Liu, who was very active in the left, and he actually left the group partly because of the way they treated homosexuals at the time. But I would speak out against it. And so I didn't, it wasn't the left I was worried about. It was mostly fundamentalist Christians from my home, from my homeland that I try to avoid getting into arguments with.
Got it. Thank you very much. So there's a way in which we think about activism as going to demonstrations and firebombing cop cars and, making appeals to the Supreme Court. In other words, direct action or legislative action. And I appreciate you declaring documenting social movements as a form of activism. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see activism and archives and your role in social change?
I think it's not just violent action. I think, to me, even simple actions of going out to a demonstration can make people realize that you're part of a larger movement, and it's not just an individual. I know mostly I've talked about myself as an individual, but of course none of this would have happened without other people in the same group or committed to the same protests. And I think I learned to pick up a lot of things after a protest, signs that were thrown away, leaflets that were tossed or given to me. And I would particularly ask for leaflets when I go places now. In Hong Kong, I was picking up a lot of leaflets in the 2019 protests when I was there back in Hong Kong then. And so it's important to collect this stuff, even though a lot of it is digitized. Hong Kong U actually has an archive, a digital archive of leaflets from the protest movement. It's stored on the Hong Kong Free Press website. And there's probably thousands and thousands of leaflets from the protests. And you can search it. The metadata is quite good. You can search what's in Chinese or English. If the signs are in Chinese, then you can search that too. So that's been very helpful. But not everything is, I kind of like artifacts myself. I think people like to touch it. I collect a lot of alternative press, underground press from the 60s and 70s. And I think future researchers would love to actually touch this stuff, have a tactile sensation responding to it, instead of just reading it on a computer screen.
Thanks, Dan. We're noticing that your audio is a little bit echoey. I don't know if something got bumped on your phone, or if you could just take a minute to see if it gets better. And if it doesn't, we'll keep going. But if you might be able to fix it.
Yeah, I don't know.
There it goes. Perfect. It's good now. Yeah.
Okay. I just pressed the button.
Oh, great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, thank you. Can you talk about what's been the most challenging events or movements to document?
To document something, most challenging?
Yeah, the most challenging thing that it's been to document or movement, or what have been some challenges in documenting the things that you've documented?
I think the problem in Hong Kong is that people are now beginning to get rid of things. I'm a collector, so I'm appalled that people need to throw things away. But I understand that under repressive legislation, a piece of paper like something that says that you want to protest against the government or against the state, that would be evidence of your intent towards sedition or something. And so, to me, it's a piece of paper doesn't really mean that. It just is a document of what happened during the time, but individual who has it may not. I could have Mein Kampf in my home. Doesn't mean I agree with Hitler. So I think it's kind of stupid to assume that just because you have something, you're going to believe everything that you have on that that is written on that piece of paper. So the challenge is what to do with people that are trying to get rid of stuff. And so I think the one way is to put it on the cloud, if there's a way to scan it and put it on the cloud, or to somehow get it out of Hong Kong. The museums there and the libraries actually have a lot of collections. Many libraries actually collect stuff about Hong Kong, and they still have protest material. It's just that the mob that's out there against books, for instance, have focused on public libraries, not research libraries. Partly because in Hong Kong, the research libraries are not accessible that easily. You have to be a student or academic to be able to go to the library to use it. If you're outsider, it's a little bit harder to get in even. Although I suppose it could be on the catalog. But mostly they've been targeting public libraries for removal of books since the national security law was enacted. And so I think that's a danger. There's a movie called 10 years, I think. 10 years, and it was about 10 years in future from 2015 or something, when it was made, when it was released. And it's about what would happen in the future. And there's one store that was collecting books. And it turned out they were collecting the books that were banned by the new government in Hong Kong, and in 10 years' time or so. And they had stored them all in the attic. And so at some point, the attic filled up with more books than in the store itself. So they were banned books that somebody had the foresight to save them and retain them. So I think for us, I think the future for librarians who are interested in or involved in this stuff, it's a way to how can we keep Hong Kong identity in existence abroad while you're in the diaspora, as well as keep Hong Kong materials, Hong Kong studies materials, accessible to people abroad, even if it's not accessible in Hong Kong. So libraries might decide not to list things in their catalog. They may still have them, but they just take it off from the catalog, so people may not think they have them. And so that's one way to resist the oppression, is to survive, you know. I mean, and it may take 20 years. Look at Eastern Europe. It may take 20 years for things to improve. And so I think it's a long struggle. One thing about the protests in Hong Kong is the young people think they can get changes right away. And as an activist for 50 years, I know you can't. You know, it's a long struggle. And they could always be reversed. Trump could get back in power, and things could reverse quickly. Even the Supreme Court would change, right? And so I think those who think that now we're living a good life here may be mistaken.
Thank you. Dan, could you push the button again, whatever button you pushed last time? Your audio is a little bit echoey again.
Okay.
Is that better? Can you just say a few things?
Yeah, okay. Try that.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you. I was so fascinated by your Fulbright in China in particular, where you talked about how you were going to go, think about how folks were protesting, collecting protest culture in China.
In Hong Kong.
In Hong Kong, okay. And I was just wondering what things you found in terms of how protest culture had been archived.
Well, I realized that most of the stuff that's been archived have been from artists during the umbrella movement and given to universities. But in the public, I think people wondered how could you save your own histories, your own oral histories, whatever, about your life in Hong Kong. And so I gave a talk at an NGO that served the local community in To Gua Wan, it's called Refreshing Hong Kong kind of thing, renovating Hong Kong in the Chinese name. We sell Hong Kong, and the members go to different people's homes and try to fix a computer, fix a light bulb, and do all sorts of things. So when I went there, they moved everything from the storefront and set up chairs, and there was like 30 or 40 people there. And I was able to talk about archiving normal stuff, even Facebook and digital lives, your digital lives. There's a way to either specify somebody to have access to your pages after you're no longer here, or or you can actually just give your password to a close friend, and they can archive it, save it. And so that's what happened in Hong Kong. I think after the Apple Daily closed, a lot of people started scanning, but it was too late. It really is too late. If you want to do this stuff, you have to do it at the time, not when they are shut down. And so in the week that they were about to shut down, or a few days that they were about to shut down, a lot of people scanned it and put it on blockchain or something. But I think, to me, the Internet Archive is useful. It has saved a lot of stuff, but a lot of time I used to do Internet Archive web crawls for UC Irvine, and I scanned a lot of umbrella movement stuff starting in 2014. And so for a few years, I left in 2016, so two years or so, I was web crawling a lot of stuff. And one of the activists once asked me at a talk at Chinese U, is that ethical to save stuff of political protests? And that's the danger, I think, because the police now are using stuff online against you, to even punish you for something you said 2 years ago, 4 years ago. But to me, it's okay because they already have their own files. They're not going to my files, what I say. The police have their own surveillance. So they are able to capture a lot of stuff. So I don't think I'm contributing to any kind of danger there. But it is true that people are now afraid to talk to you. They probably won't want, that's why I want to talk to you again. So most of the interviews I've done during my Fulbright days, in Hong Kong, I was interviewing a lot of people, including people that are in jail or in exile now. And so it's a contemporary record of what they felt at the time. So I think that's useful to have a document of the time. And I'd like to interview more people and talk about how they're coping with this new laws. So I think there are ways to survive and still archive materials. Anyway.
So Dan, you've begun to talk about this a little bit, but definitely archiving and collecting has shifted with sort of the explosion of the digital age, right?
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about how it's changed and whether anything would be lost or gained, or how you think you have to change in order to continue collecting?
Well, I think a lot of people are under the misimpression that because it's online, it's archived. To me, as a data librarian, I always tell people that you have to curate the collection. Just putting it online is not archiving it, because a website could go down and it may not be saved by Internet Archive. Internet Archive sometimes will crawl a page and get the first screen, but doesn't go in depth into the content. So it's misleading. Sometimes you think, oh, Internet Archive has this title, but when you go to it, it doesn't actually have any depth to it. So I think as a data librarian, we think of curated collections, data that is archived in a repository that is curated, that looks at data and tries to save it for future kind of permutations as technology changes. Whether you can read it in future or not. And so it's archived in some form that you can actually be able to read it in 100 years, but who knows, So I think the digital is a little bit, people think, oh, wow, so much is on digital, it must be too much there, it must be all there, but it's not all there. And also, I'm really into artifacts, like I said. So I think paper is actually much more, should last longer, it seems to me. A digital seems kind of ephemeral to me. So I think that's one of the challenges today is having people recognize that just because you want to scan every book from Hong Kong and put it somewhere in some library, and it's not going to work, because you have to have a system, and you have to an ad hoc thing I don't think would work. So right now, there's still no collective system trying to preserve materials from Hong Kong. It's all ad hoc kind of things. Yeah.
Right. And Dan, just to give us a little bit of background about your own interest in documenting social movements, when did you decide that you wanted to be a archivist? When did you begin collecting and documenting? What was your motivation? And has that motivation changed in the past 20, 30 years?
Well, I started as a teenager. I think I was collecting stuff in Hong Kong. I was collecting stuff about Cultural Revolution. I have stamps from Hong Kong that from China, sorry, that were about early days of different protests. And I think eventually I knew that some things were no longer able to be. I kind of had the idea that if you don't collect it, it will never be there again. I remember going to one of the hearings in some of the protests. The police had caught some of the protesters in the 60s, the British police, and it was not nice. They were beating up the protesters. And I went to one of the hearings where one of the people that were beat up in the 60s showed his scars from beating that mostly were internal, but there were some scars. So I was a high school student then. I was pretty struck. And so I realized that if this kind of stuff goes on and the police are able to engage in arbitrary kind of behavior with no consequence, the need for documentation is important. The need to have records of what happened. So that was my early awakening and then I went to visit the Public Records Office in 1969, in 1970, 69 in New York, 1970 in London. I was on a semester abroad studying British politics. And so it was supposed to be at the LSE, London School of Economics, but they were on strike, the students, over the US involvement in Vietnam. So we couldn't be based there. So they put us in a hotel, but we had a Labour MP as our professor, and he came and taught in the hotel dining room, I guess, one of the rooms. And so I was able to get him to write a letter to let me get into the Public Records Office, which is now the National Archives of UK. And I was researching, so that was kind of sparked my interest in documenting and recording stuff, looking at the records that were there. And I was researching the early days, the past in Hong Kong, especially what they decided at that time to think about the future of Hong Kong in the 70s. And my dissertation, my honors thesis was about the future of Hong Kong in 1971. And I interviewed the MP that was in charge of Hong Kong, would be in charge. I think he would later be in charge of Hong Kong affairs. So I was able to realize the importance of archival material. Although I didn't really study, I actually I worked in special collections at Temple University, but mostly my collection was a print collection. It was in the contemporary culture collection, which collected underground papers from all over the US. And so I was a librarian there under Office of Education grant for 2 years. Office of Education later became the Department of Education in the US. So anyway, so I'm thankful to all these agencies for funding my job actually, and giving me a taste of what it would be like, what these archives would look like.
Great, thank you, Dan. So now it's actually the time is for audience folks to have a conversation with you. I think there's been a bunch of questions coming in. And Kim, I believe you're gonna take over.
Hi there, hi guys. Yeah, we have a lot of questions coming in. So the first question is actually someone in the crowd would like you to elaborate on the term add oil, gayo in Cantonese or jiao in Mandarin, and why is this particular term banned by the CCP government?
My understanding is it was a recent thing because they think that's like a challenging, it's actually a sports thing, right? I mean, they chanted it during the Olympics or during the different competitions where Hong Kong participants won their races, and everybody said "Ga Yao," and so I think it's just because they think it's a way to rally Hong Kongers, and so one judge, I think, or one in one case, I think, thought that that was a bad thing. And so it may get eventually challenged totally in court. So a lot of these things are just opinions of people, maybe even judges, or sometimes even government officials say you can't do this, you can't do that. But unless it's actually confirmed in a court case, I'm not sure if this one was confirmed. Yeah.
And to kind of build off of that question, Anna was wondering, have conditions in Hong Kong changed for the LGBTQ queer community in Hong Kong since '97, and honestly, even more so recently, right after 2014 and 2019? And where do you see that heading?
I have pictures of a lot of the activists in Hong Kong that are now in exile or in prison, marching during gay pride marches in Hong Kong. And of course the consulates were, or the different Western consulates were there during Pink Dot in Hong Kong. Now, because of the new change in law saying that you can't collude with the foreign governments, they're probably less likely to show up, and the foreign consulates, and also the fact that gay people have been imprisoned under national security law. Ray Chan was a openly gay lawmaker in the Legislative Council, and he was just recently released, although his trial has not happened yet. He was one of 50-some people that were originally arrested, and now 47 of them are going on trial for just taking part in a primary, in an unofficial primary, which the government ruled illegal subsequently. And so at the same time, I think the gay games people were very hopeful to hold gay games in Hong Kong. And I think they just postponed it again. But because I was thinking that it would be quite a disaster to hold gay games in Hong Kong when former gay legislator is in prison. And also they were supposed to have it a few this year, this coming year, and now they've postponed it more. And so I think the problem is being gay and being activists politically may or may not be the same thing. To me, it's the same thing, but to many activists, it's just a game. Gay games is just a sport. Just like Olympics, but that forgets that the creator of the gay games, Wardell, I think his name was, he always thought that it was a political thing to have a gay games because it's coming out in support of gay people, and so that's very political. I think my activism in gay liberation was because at the time we did not sanitize gay liberation. We did not think gay liberation was just about getting happily married and having your own home with a dog. We didn't think that was the middle class values. we thought it was struggle, and it was fighting the police. And so I think it's quite different view of gay liberation, whereas now everything is desexualized. And so we wanted a society that was free of government repression in our sex lives, especially. And now, since it's gone to the Supreme Court over many of these cases about gay marriage and stuff, sex is kind of not mentioned. And maybe that's the way to get reform. But to me, I was not into reform. I was not a reformist. I'm more on the side of the street people. So my idea was not so much legislative change, but awakening people, alerting people to how draconian the state can be. So to me, in Hong Kong, there's always going to be a struggle between those who want to change the society more radically than those who want to carry it on. That's it.
All right. And I had another question. What kind of gay movies were available at the time when you were growing up, and where were these produced, and what decade was this? So I'm assuming she's asking more so Cantonese film and media in the time that you were growing up, and even here in the US, because you've spent most of your time here in the US.
What were the films that were prevalent then?
Yes. Yeah.
I think Sunday Bloody Sunday, I think, was one that was a British film that I saw in Hong Kong. And to me, that was a quite interesting thing about ambisexuality, polyamory, because this one guy was involved with a woman, and then also involved with another guy, I think. And so it was quite interesting because I was more interested in the sexual dynamics that so to me it was very gay affirming that the mother of this character was asked, what do you think about your son being gay? And he said, well, he's my son, so and then I think one of the characters was asked and then something about this relationship, and he said, well, it's half a loaf is better than none at all. So that was interesting. I remember those quotes. So there was mostly British and American films, but I don't actually remember too much detail. So that's a good thing to research what I saw in those days. Yeah.
Yeah, and we have this question coming in from Steve. He was wondering if there was a relationship between library archives and Wikipedia entries. He knows that API ENC has created some wiki profiles, and if you can maybe speak to that.
Yeah, a lot of librarians actually are, what do you call them, people that participate in Wikipedia. Even my own entry was revised by a librarian that offered to help me and revise it. And so more recently. And so there's no direct connection, but there are a lot of librarians are actually editors and do change things, involved in changing things, revising entries. Of course, now it's become quite controversial because if you mention something about China, then, or if you don't put China after the name, then people might get upset. So, so it's become politicized much more than before.
Yeah, and we have another follow-up question from Anna. Thank you, Anna, for your participation and your engaging questions. She's wondering if, she says, so when you were growing up in Hong Kong, many of these gay-themed movies were from overseas, ? For the most part.
They were, yeah. They were mostly from overseas, you're right.
Yeah, and the next this is kind of like a two question from Zanasia. The question is, what about Irvine did you know that it was the place for you to call second home while doing your archival work with your multifaceted identities? And what is one particular collection that you admire to this day and why?
What is it about Irvine?
Yeah, what is it about Irvine that drew you to Irvine?
Did I move to Irvine? Oh, they gave me a job. I was, by that time was in a public library, Philadelphia, Free Library of Philadelphia, which is the public library. And I wanted to get back into academia. And so they gave me a job and they made the job offer. And I was sitting at the reference desk.
Oh, Dad, we can't hear you. You're cutting out again if you wanna.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, you're still a little echoey. Oh, no, it's still a little echoey.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'll put it away from further away from me.
You are still echoing a little bit.
So anyway, I wanted a job, so I took the job. And it's special collections that I liked. It's mostly underground press materials that I had exposed myself to in Temple University. But more recently I got involved with a commercial vendor, Gale, and they have been digitizing queer collections dating back to the 17th century. And for instance, they scanned all the books that were in the private library in the UK British Museum that were banned before. And so I'm on the board of this gender and sexuality archive. So I think that collection has a lot of gay liberation materials, but they are looking at materials from Asia also. So I'm hoping to help them with that. But in the past, and that collection is basically, they work with archives, community-based archives like Lesbian History Archives in New York, and they come in and scan some of the collection, and then they they scan it and give it, and then give a copy of the scanned item back to the community archive, and they can use it for 7 years internally, and then afterwards they can put it online, make it accessible. So the Gale expects not to, so basically they're working with private collections, community-based archives to collect this stuff. The other collection I like that I'm accumulating myself is FBI files on activists. And so that kind of stuff is kind of sometimes not, some of it is online at the FBI. You can actually go to the FBI website and you can see a lot of stuff. But I have some files from J. Edgar Hoover where he was against gay people, and they had captioned the file Fag Liberation Movement. And so anyway, so there were all these kind of terrible stuff that was written down by the FBI director or his aides to try to dismiss. So there were thousands of files on gay liberation movement because they thought it was a left-wing threat to the government. Yeah. And that's why probably I was spied on, because I was gay and an activist. And also I was indexing this left-wing magazine. And so they thought I must be a threat. But they eventually, now actually the magazine is online at the CIA's headquarters on their website. They have a Freedom of Information release section, and the magazine that caused me to be spied on is now online. So they didn't see anything wrong with the magazine eventually.
Yeah, so we have another question coming in, and let me find it. Where did it go? How do you archive social media pages? And this is definitely where younger generations need archival needs are needed. If you can speak more to that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one way is to create a collection specifically for like Hong Kong U did for protest material from 2019 in Hong Kong, and they've scanned in posters that they've gotten from online channels, Telegram and other sites that have images, and so they copied all the images and then added metadata that had the text of the image, and then also information about it in English and Chinese and Cantonese. And so, so that's one way. If you can download metadata, download images from existing social media, if there's a way to do that. If you can do that, Facebook itself actually sells images that you put up on your own site as a book. Sometimes I make fun of people that people don't really read today, and they would be asked online in a profile, what book do you read? And they say Facebook. But in fact, Facebook actually does issue books now, and they have issued a couple. They scan, they issue the pictures you put online, and the quality is quite good. Actually, I've gotten a couple of them about the images I put on Facebook, and so it's high quality imaging, and so that's one way to print it out as a book, and they also send you a digital file. So, but that's a commercial thing. Internet Archive would be another place to do it, but sometimes you need. I'm thinking that more needs to be done to capture things totally, because videos are harder to capture. I mean, unless you have a YouTube, because recently Radio Hong Kong, Radio RTHK, the public broadcaster in Hong Kong, decided not to post stuff up after a limited time, and so all that archives now could be potentially lost. Some of it is actually in libraries in Hong Kong, and some of it is in the Internet Archive. So it may not be totally lost. But so Internet Archive is another place. But if you have web skills, I think that's one way to be involved. Write a program that you can capture, screen capture stuff, and then save it, and then work with the library outside Hong Kong program to decide to take it.
Yeah, and if you would like to fix your sound again, you're kind of cutting out again. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so one last question I have for you to close out the program is there any message you'd like to pass on to the younger generations, whether that's in archival work, in activist work, and how to, keep it going?
I think if you're a student, you can volunteer to collect stuff and then see if a library can take it, or if you want to keep it yourself. In the old days, there was this big debate about whether or not to give stuff to institutions. We didn't believe in institutions that much. We thought community-based archives were the best. But the problem, I think, with community-based archives, with some exceptions, Lesbian History Archive is still existing, but many community-based archives ended up being absorbed by institutions. And so, because there's no sustainability, maybe, it's less, but that doesn't mean in universities or academia will preserve everything. Libraries actually don't preserve everything. They have a process called weeding. Every academic library has it. They get rid of books, actually. But archives are supposed to retain stuff. So I think the other thing you could do is, if you're not in Hong Kong, then it's probably safer to collect stuff and put it on a cloud. I mean, even in Hong Kong, you could put it on a cloud and maybe not have it accessible that easily. So I think that's, but I also keep a diary, I think. I wish I had more of a diary. I don't have that much of a diary found, collected myself, my own diaries from my time living here, my activism and stuff. Partly because I think I was so busy doing stuff that usually the best diaries are often reflective, and I didn't have time, or when you're sad. When you're sad, you want to write about something. But when you're happy and you're doing stuff, you don't have time to write. And so, but if you can keep a journal, maybe that's the way to do it, and jot down some notes. And later on, you can read about what you felt in reaction to things going on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan. So we're going to close out our program today. Thank you so much, Dan and Amy, for joining us today. Thank you for Angelo in the back end and Sho for putting this program together. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here with us today. And check out our upcoming exhibit. We are Bruce Lee Under the Sky, One Family, coming to the CHSA Museum space in San Francisco in February 2022. And this actually wraps up the last program that CHSA is doing for the year. So we're really excited to see you in the new year. And until next time, you guys have a great day wherever you are, night, morning, or afternoon.